comments and keep building good stuff. But I don't know, Vitalik, what would be your message to the crypto community?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I've said again a bit earlier here, if you want to see, if you believe in crypto because you want crypto to bring about some particular thing, then go build the thing. We need to, I think, a bit to have a bit more of that lovely, juicy, definite optimism in our crypto world. And I think if more people did that, that would even help bring more positivity into the space, right? I think when people are in builder mindset, people are just naturally much more cooperative than when people are in a kind of zero-sum political warfare mindset. And the more that we can kind of do things to pull ourselves out of the patterns that lead to kind of people being stuck defending specific positions that they've chosen years ago and just yelling insults at each other on Twitter, and move toward like using debate as an actual tool to figure out what the right answers actually are, and with an eye to actually starting to build toward them, then I think we can come up with and help build a much better crypto space.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think that one of the really inspiring things is that both of you embody these values so well, and it enables you to last 10 plus years in industry, and it's going to enable you to continue building and collaborating and continuing to create the future that we want to see for the next 20, 30 years. I just want to say thank you guys, both of you for everything you've done for the space, and for Ethereum, for the broader crypto ecosystem. And I want to thank both of you for taking the time to come on this podcast and chat. I had a wonderful time, and with that, thank you so much for coming, and have a good day.
Thanks,
Have a good
Victor.
day to you too.
Yeah. See y'all soon.
Today's conversation is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal or investment advice. Actual results may vary materially from any forward-looking statements made and are subject to risks and uncertainties.
Hi everyone, my name is Victor Buterin, and I am a protocol specialist over at Coinbase Cloud. Today, it's my pleasure to host a special conversation between Brian Armstrong, the co-founder and CEO of Coinbase, and Vitalik Buterin, the co-founder of Ethereum. We're going to be discussing a lot of really important industry topics, from decentralization to the road to the merge, to leadership, culture, privacy, and many other things. Goes without saying, there's no legal, financial, regulatory, policy, or even life advice being given during this conversation. So please sit back and enjoy. Thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Victor Buterin, and with me I have Vitalik Buterin and Brian Armstrong. Normally these folks need no introduction, but I will go ahead and introduce them anyway. Vitalik is the co-founder of Ethereum. Ethereum is one of the largest and most decentralized smart contract platforms in the world, if not the largest. He has done a ton of stuff around crypto for more than a decade now. He's been involved with Bitcoin before. Now he's pushing the envelope on things like soul-bound NFTs and other tracks. Brian has also been in crypto for more than a decade. Did a lot of work on Bitcoin and Bitcoin wallets, and over time has built Coinbase, which, as you know and love, is the exchange, but also has a number of other components to it, such as Prime and wallet and custody and cloud and other services. And so these two folks are legends, and thank you guys so much for taking the time to join us on this podcast.
Thanks, Victor. Thanks for joining, Vitalik. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you guys too. We
are going to dive into a couple of really interesting topics, some spicy, some philosophical. There is a rough agenda for what we're going to be covering. So we are going to talk about the merge a little bit, although we're going to sidestep all the super basic concepts around it, and we're going to go right into some of the meat. We're going to talk a lot about decentralization, what's next for the crypto ecosystem, philosophy, leadership, and at the end, we're going to have a party round. And that's going to be an opportunity for you guys to ask questions of each other, taking turns, for anything else that wasn't covered, but that is top of mind for you. With that, I'll kick us off and just talk a little bit about the merge. So a lot has been said there, but moving Ethereum to proof of stake has been discussed for years and years and years, and in some circles even before the proof of work blockchain was even launched. But one thing that I'm curious with both of you is whether there was a particular moment that stands out to you, you can recall, that proof of stake really made sense and made you believe that it's a viable path forward, even during a time when proof of work was so dominant in the industry.
I think for me personally, I was never hostile to proof of stake. So if you look back to some of the articles that I wrote in Bitcoin Magazine back in 2013, I wrote one piece about proof of stake, which I remember was very friendly, though it also talked about how it's still a very new idea and there's still a bunch of problems that people are thinking about and trying to figure out. And then in 2014, in January, one of the very first posts on the Ethereum blog was about this proposed algorithm called Slasher, and that was the one that introduced this concept of slashing, where you get penalized if you vote for two things that contradict each other. And this was my attempt at trying to make inroads at solving what proof of stake critics call the nothing at stake problem. Basically the problem that in proof of work, if you want to build on top of two blocks, you have to do double the work to build on top of each, but in proof of stake, you can just sign as many things as you want. And sort of adding this explicit penalty to signing more than one thing was the solution for that. So over the course of 2014, we were doing a whole bunch of research around seeing just how far can this go? What actually are the security assumptions that we have to rely on? How effective can we make this slashing mechanism? Can we solve some of the other problems? Can we even make proof of stake actually be more secure than proof of work? So by having slashing penalties eat into deposits instead of just eating into the rewards. And there was this post actually at the end of 2014 where we talked about this concept of weak subjectivity, this notion that in a proof of stake network, unfortunately, you do have to make an assumption that in order to benefit from the full security guarantees, a node has to log on and be online at least once in a while. And you can make that while pretty long. You can make it a week, you can make it a month, you can make it a year. The longer you make it, basically, the more inconvenient it is for stakers from a liquidity perspective. So there's a trade-off. But ironically enough, for me, I think it was realizing that that was the trade-off and that was an unavoidable trade-off that actually made me comfortable with it, because it made me realize that okay, this is the weakness. And at the same time, I felt confident that this is all that there is. And that certainty, that kind of realization that it's not an unknown anymore, and it is this very specific thing that we can understand philosophically. That was this really big switch that made me very comfortable with it, because it's instead of jumping into a pond where you have no idea what kinds of weird alien sharks are inside of it. It's we finally put a robot submarine into the pond and we kind of cataloged the robot sharks a bit, and we understand where they are on the phylogenetic tree and what their DNA is, and it's even if they're still scary sharks, it's just we understand what they are, and we understand how to deal with the problems, and we understand that actually it's not nearly bad enough to kind of be fatal to the entire project. And that made me confident. And from there on, the proof of stake research, of course, continued, and there was years worth of stuff that followed, but it was on much more kind of high level stuff can we actually make proof of stake only the security level depend on deposits instead of just rewards, right? Because if you can't, then the whole thing becomes 100 times more secure or whatever. And so even starting from 2015, the difficulties were basically even already kind of self-imposed difficulties, because we started setting really high standards for ourselves.
That's a great way to give the overview. And I think that weak subjectivity, which we're not going to cover in depth on this podcast, but it's actually kind of wild, because the assumption it kind of makes is that human society will continue working at a super high level, that we will be able to agree on things. We will be able to come together as people at a high level. But yeah, it's a super fascinating trade-off. That's kind of the layman's explanation of it. But Brian, I want to kick it over to you. Super curious for your take.
Yeah, well, I have to admit, I was actually skeptical of proof of stake when I first heard about it. And it took me probably, a year or two to kind of come around. And, when I first heard about it, my initial thought was the halting problem in computer science is kind of this. It says that you can't really prove like, will this piece of code finish executing? And so when people started talking about like a Turing complete language on a blockchain, I was like, this sounds so easy to defeat it and to attack it. And so I was initially just skeptical. But I'd say after a couple of years, I really got proved wrong on that. And I started looking more into it. I'd credit Fred Ursum. I think he was watching a lot of this stuff closely, and he pushed me to take another close look at it. And just seeing Vitalik make progress on it and the apps that started to come out, I think we eventually came around to this idea at Coinbase. We're like, okay, we're going to have to be agnostic on every chain that's coming out, every token. We can't be sitting here like in our ivory tower only focused on one asset. My initial hope actually in the early days of crypto was that Bitcoin was going to be the one chain. It was going to be like TCP/IP or something, and everything, all the apps, was going to get built on top of one chain. Because I was always thinking about it from a usability point of view, and it's just so much simpler for customers to come in. We had a hard enough time explaining to them what even Bitcoin was, so it's like now we have to explain like dozens of different blockchains and tokens, and I was like, oh, this is going to be so difficult. Couldn't they just put this all into one chain? We can kind of upgrade Bitcoin, but obviously that has its own risks, and there was a whole controversy around that, which I won't get into. But that caused us to move over and like start to just say, all right, we're gonna have to support many things over time and be more agnostic.
I think it's a great point, and I think that something like proof of stake, and honestly, like the question about Bitcoin proof of work was that either it makes sense and it works, or it's a really dumb idea and it's going to go to zero. And so as the kind of confidence around proof of stake continued to increase, and it's like, okay, maybe it's like not a dumb idea and it has a potential to work. And as soon as you're able to start building up some of that confidence, then you can kind of like carry it forward and really play it out and start making different trade-offs around like what the design space looks like.
One other thing I'll mention on that, I think there's a really nice relationship between like scientists and engineers in the world, and I think of Vitalik as kind of like this brilliant computer scientist, and he's also many other things, philosopher, whatever. But there's people out there who are just frankly probably smarter than me that are like, all right, let's do the math proof, let's write the new breakthrough idea on paper. And then I was never the person who was going to make that kind of math proof breakthrough or whatever, but I was always the person like, okay, if this looks promising, I can barely understand it, let's go try to commercialize it and try to get tens of millions of people using it. So I think that's a really important thing, by the way, in society broadly. It's like, there's a lot of ideas that exist in laboratories and science that just never get commercialized to actually benefit humanity. And when it does happen, awesome things happen. Like you get Genentech and SpaceX and Google and stuff like that, which all kind of came out of research organizations. So anyway, I feel very grateful in the world that there are people like Satoshi and Vitalik and all the people doing more on the scientific side, so that engineers, CEOs like me can kind of hopefully build companies around it.
I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because that's a really interesting thread that I'm going to pull. So, I think that Coinbase, both gets a lot of credit and also some detractors for the amount of work that we've done to, as you mentioned, like commercialize and get it out there and onboard people and like really make a lot of this stuff usable. And that always creates like a little bit of tension around you're saying this decentralized things and you're centralizing parts of it, right? Or that we do as Coinbase in order to make it more accessible and usable and user-friendly and all that stuff. But there's like a natural tension there. And, I'd be curious to get, both of your takes, but also, especially Vitalik's, just on, how you see that tension, continue to evolve. Like, is there like a Puritan view there, or is that tension always going to be there? We just have to do our best to navigate it.
One of the ways that I kind of think about it is that the crypto space in general tends to have this like principles versus expediency trade-off like very deeply inside of it, and sometimes it even goes in cycles, right? Where like basically if things kind of continue in a way that feels stable, or even worse, like feels bullish for some amount of time, then kind of people start getting a bit more lax, and the expediency side starts kind of winning out over time. But then eventually there's always some kind of event, and it's always like some shock event that makes people realize like, wait, the principles in the space actually matter. The most recent big event for this actually is like a couple of months back, the Terra Luna situation, right? I think a lot of kind of more principles-oriented people felt like, we were howling at the wind, and like when we were saying like, no, this is not a new paradigm. Anything that offers 20% APRs is like definitely totally a scam. And then, you had all of these kind of elite professional-looking investment funds saying, no, this is totally cool. And it turns out that they were very wrong. And over the course of about 96 hours, a lot of people's opinions on a lot of things changed. So I think like that's part of the reason why it's important to kind of keep the principles in mind, whether by principles in decentralization or privacy, or just simple things like making sure your protocols are like economically sound. Though I think there's also this like other side of the trade-off where you do have to kind of like actually survive long enough, and you don't want to kind of go insolvent before the market becomes rational again. And that's it's a hard trade-off. I think it's something that we grapple with internally, even within the Ethereum project. I mean, I think like the things that are closer to the base layer tends to be things where it's more important to like be principled and like be incredibly neutral, and be decentralized and like be more uncompromising in those values, because like if the bottom layer breaks or gets corrupted in some way, then like ultimately everything built on top of that goes into the trash too. And I do think that things that are built on top do have like more leeway, right? Because like ultimately the point of a startup is not to have a 90% plus chance of surviving. The point of a startup is to have a 10% chance of being great instead of just a 1% chance of being great. And I think like that, like that does lead to a different mindset. Though at the same time, I do think that like as things in the ecosystem become systemically important, it does like start to make sense to like care about some of those other things too.
I agree. Decentralization is super important. That's like the original ethos of crypto. Occasionally these flare-ups happen and people get reminded of how important it is. And I think it's also important to note that like decentralization is a spectrum, right? So sometimes people, like especially early on, they'd say, oh, Coinbase is so centralized. And if you buy your crypto and you store it with us, okay, it's being stored in one place. We built these things like Coinbase Wallet. You can move it to self-custody. And so, and even if you're storing it with Coinbase, we're using open protocols, decentralized protocols. So you can move it off of Coinbase to any other wallet or custodian whenever you want, right? And so that's much more decentralized than, say, I don't know, like the Visa network, where only one company controls that entire network, as opposed to like we don't control the Bitcoin network or Ethereum network, obviously. So anyway, more decentralization is generally better. It does kind of slow down development, so there's always a balance. Like we're seeing that now with the move to Web3, and we're seeing a lot of apps that are being built kind of, I would call it Web 2.5. Like, okay, they have a decentralized token, but all their stuff is not going on chain in IPFS or something like that. And so the tools are getting better and better to go more and more decentralized over time. I think hopefully that's the direction that things go. But you always have to be thoughtful about that, and because if you let it get too centralized, it'll get co-opted. And there's a great book called The Master Switch, which talks about the history of networks like the telegram and radio and television and the internet, and they all follow this theme where they're initially super decentralized, they eventually consolidate, and then they get co-opted, and then people have to move to the next network to get true freedom again. And so I think that's a little bit happening with the internet, and it's a little bit at risk. Crypto hopefully has 100 years or something before anything like that becomes a real threat, and maybe there'll be some other paradigm after that. But of course, the most recent issue of this was Tornado Cash. We could talk about that too, because I do think it's kind of concerning. Some of the Ethereum miners and things like that seems to be like they just proactively started censoring transactions. So we can talk about that later too.
I don't think that we need to wait until later. I think people would love to hear you guys talk about it now. I just want to like maybe point out for the audience around like the latest Ethereum mine. I believe it was Ethermine that decided to start censoring, and like what does the new ruling mean for validators? What does it mean for Ethereum? What does it mean for the merge and the transition? And so it's a huge and meaty topic. There's a lot to discuss there. So maybe like one of the ways in which I'll kick us off is, Vitalik, a lot has been said around, the transition from proof of work to proof of stake, around the transition from mining pools to validators. And one of the questions I was raised is kind of like, okay, well, how does the transition impact Ethereum's censorship, properties, right? Like how decentralized is it? How resistant is it to control? And so one of the things I was hoping is that you could tell us a little bit about, how does, the way that Ethereum is designed, there's no ETH 2.0, right? But it's like the new combined network. Tell us a little bit about the design decisions and how they are interacting with censorship, whether by enabling it or by making it more difficult to censor over an extended period of time.
Yeah, so I think there's quite a few differences between proof of work Ethereum, or at least historical proof of work Ethereum, and proof of stake Ethereum. And it's kind of important to unpack a lot of those differences, because people, like, in the Twitter sphere or wherever else, often end up talking about things as a package deal. And you get people occasionally even saying things like, oh, proof of stake is bad because, look at Ethereum's fast block times. And it's like, no, those are two separate issues. So I think, like, the way that I would categorize the different issues are, one, proof of work versus proof of stake, right? So this just has to do with, like, who is responsible for kind of creating blocks, building on top of other blocks, forming consensus, and doing all of those things. And the differences between proof of work and proof of stake is basically, in proof of work, it's miners, who are these kind of generally businesses that buy up large amounts of mining hardware, find someplace to run them with cheap electricity and cheap operating costs, and like storage and cooling and all of those things. And then they just run the miners 24/7 and try to make a profit and hopefully keep the network running at the same time. In proof of stake, sometimes I use the metaphor of virtual mining, where the idea is like you're putting in your coins and you're sort of converting your coins into a virtual miner. And the Ethereum network kind of simulates the process of mining in the sense of like randomly assigning these depositors the right to create a block. So the practical differences are, I think, one is just who can do it. So I mean, my view, which is, of course, vary on the pro proof of stake side in like a bunch of dimensions. If you want to hear the pro proof of work view, there's plenty of accounts with words like HODL in their names that you can consult for those views. But my own view is there's a couple of significant benefits to the proof of stake approach. One is that it is more accessible to be a participant, and it's even more censorship resistant to be a participant, because like if you're a miner, you have to have a large amount of capital to make a mining farm. You have to be pretty significant in size. These are things that are quite detectable. Government has plenty of experience sort of finding and detecting large energy consumers in the context of wanting to arrest people growing the wrong kind of plants from time to time. So this is the sort of thing that's like findable. Whereas in proof of stake, like all you need is just a computer somewhere with an internet connection somewhere, and that's just like much easier to censorship resist. It's much easier to just hop jurisdictions even at a moment's notice if you feel under threat. It's much smaller, more nimble. More people can do it because of the lower capital requirements. So those are kind of my arguments for proof of stake over proof of work in general. But then there's also two other issues that people are talking about at the same time, right? So one of those issues is the chain-based versus attestations, right? So like in consensus algorithms in crypto, there's this kind of spectrum where either you can be chain-based, which basically says you have like one block per period, and you need to wait lots of blocks before you like really have a strong consensus on any particular block, right? So this is how Bitcoin works. So you get one block on average every 10 minutes, and you wait 10 minutes, you get another block. You have to wait 6 confirmations. In Ethereum, it goes down to 13 seconds, but it's like still kind of similar. But then the opposite extreme is like Tendermint style, where literally every validator has to vote at the same time. And so you basically have your entire validator set supporting a block after only a few seconds. Ethereum takes this middle ground between the two, where we have lots of attesters kind of signing off on blocks in parallel. But at the same time, like that attestation is staggered over some period of time, so it takes like about 10 minutes for a block to finalize. mean, to be fair, I think like the latest thinking in the research team is that we want to move to what we call a single select finality. So we actually do want to kind of become more Tendermint-like over time, right? But in the middle, Ethereum is this compromise, and we have lots of this parallelization. And then there's this issue of like, is there some meaningful difference between building a block, which is like voting for the chain at the same time as creating new transactions, versus kind of proposing and attesting separately, where we have these like two separate roles, where one of those roles is creating a block and another one of those roles is basically voting on which block is the right block. And like people argue about like, are these two things actually different? I mean, my view is from like that point of view, like the censorship resistance point of view, probably not, because building a block on top of a block is ultimately still voting for a block. Attesting to a block is still voting for that block. But this is something that people will argue. The third issue, and this is the one where I think like there is quite a bit of like legitimate cause for concern, is the kind of MEV proposer builder stuff that people have been talking about recently. So the idea here basically is that on Ethereum, there are a bunch of applications that like create what we call MEV, and MEV basically means like opportunities to extract revenue by doing really clever things to like stick your transaction in front of other transactions or reorder other people's transactions, right? So like opportunities for miners or for block producers to get even more revenue by being really clever about how they produce their blocks instead of just using stock software. And now this is an issue where like Ethereum has lots of MEV and Bitcoin has very little. And so I think you can argue it as a point in Bitcoin's favor, actually, but like it's basically a consequence of the greater array of applications that Ethereum enables. And Bitcoin people argue like, see, this is exactly why it wants to have greater separation between your money and your application layer. But so like I do admit this is a point in favor of that viewpoint, but it's also kind of separate from proof of work versus proof of stake, right? So as a kind of philosopher, I think it's important to sort of like distinguish between those issues and argue at the level of concepts instead of at the level of packaged products. So there, like in the Ethereum community, there is this discourse about how do we like mitigate this problem? And one of the ideas that has developed is this concept of proposer-builder separation, where basically you separate out the role of being a validator from the role of creating blocks, and you allow the role of like creating blocks and like actually choosing what goes into blocks to become more professionalized. And then you have an auction mechanism where if you get assigned the right to create a block, you just listen to the auction, you get a bunch of bids, and you take the bid that has the, you take the highest bid, and like you use a sort of protocol, you agree with them, and they provide the block, and that block is kind of put into place, and you get whatever the payment is, right? So the nice thing about this is that it does kind of separate out the block, the role of being a validator into this role that continues to be this kind of very dummy automaton function where you just run completely automated software and you don't think about it, from this role where you actually choose what the block contents are. And this does mitigate the centralization issue, but people have raised the concern of like, well, what if one or a couple of builders become so much better than the rest of the builders that they start producing all the blocks, and this also becomes a censorship risk. And there are strategies for mitigating this, right? So like there is this concept of partial block auctions where instead of the builder constructing the entire block, the builder just constructs most of the block, and then if they missed any transactions, the validator can still add a couple of more transactions. But like this is still a research area, right? And I do think that there's definitely fair cause for concern in figuring out like exactly kind of how much we can do to like make that side of the stack more resilient. But it's I think the good news is that it's like in order for this mechanism to start censoring, basically all the blocks have to be censoring, right? Like if even 10% of the blocks are not censoring, then you just have to wait 10 slots until you find a block that is willing to include whatever, right? So that's the good news. But at the same time, I think it's also important to not be complacent, and it is like I believe in trying to kind of like try like many different strategies at the same time and not rely too much on one. And so I think this kind of discourse about can we kind of make the ecosystem more robust, and can we kind of make a staking ecosystem that's more robust, and make a staking ecosystem where as few stakers as possible are censoring transactions. Like that's also an important discussion to have. It's an important effort to make, but it is something that requires effort, right? I think it's important to remember that in both like neither in Ethereum nor in Bitcoin nor any other system are we just kind of guaranteed that the outcomes we want happen automatically, right? I think even in the kind of the systems that try the hardest to sort of call themselves fully automated, there's definitely still like some level of community coordination that's required to make sure that those things actually happen.
Right. And I think those are all great points. There were a couple of things that I would just pull out from that that I really like that you said. I think the first thing is that just not that it's impossible, but it is practically impossible to consistently be able to censor, on Ethereum today, or with proof of stake. I think one of the things there that's kind of like really interesting is that the amount of coordination that you need across all the different validators to consistently perform this activity is like really significant. To the point where it's not really feasible. But I think the next step beyond that, beyond technical reasons, which is that, this is one of the most important properties of, any chain out there, if not the most important, right? The ability for the infrastructure to be incredibly neutral and decentralized. And so when you talk about like protocol roadmaps, there's a bunch of features that we want, right? Like we want for L2s to have cheaper transactions, right? And so there's like an EIP that's pushing that forward. We want all kinds of stuff to happen around sharding, right? So there's EIPs that are pushing that forward. But in terms of pushing forward work and prioritizing work that keeps the network decentralized, incredible, and enables validators to remain incredibly neutral, that work is always going to be prioritized ahead of everything else in order to protect the most important property of these chains that allow them to, have their value and provide their use and be helpful to the world. I would be very, very curious to hear Brian's take. It's such a big topic, and so maybe I won't even give a prompt. Brian, just take us away. What's been top of mind for you on this topic?
There may be a world where even if only 10% of the validators or something like that are still operating without censorship, it'll eventually go through or something, unless it gets to a world where it's nobody will even build on top of a block that contained a transaction that wasn't supposed to be there or whatever in their mind, right? So I think this is actually a very important moment in the history of blockchains where we need to look very closely from a policy point of view, from a community point of view, and make sure the right decisions are being made. I'm pretty concerned about these mining pools like Ethermine is an example that you mentioned earlier, Victor, that came out, and I haven't validated this myself, but it appears that they are censoring some transactions that were kind of labeled in this recent Tornado Cash issue. But if also my understanding is that this is the first time in the history of OFAC they've actually put a technology, a smart contract address on a sanction list, and this is something the lawyers are looking into at various organizations around the world. CCI, EFF, Coin Center are all looking at this and saying, actually, is that within the statutory authority of OFAC to sanction a technology? I think they may only be given the power by Congress to sanction a person or some piece of property or something like that, and not a technology. So my guess is there's going to be a court case on that'll challenge it, that has a pretty high successful chance of winning, is my guess. But let's say even if you put all of that aside, you don't think that that's going to work, or you just, in some abundance of caution, you want to make sure you don't do it. I think it's potentially risking the bigger thing that we're all trying to do here. And my personal opinion is that if any mining pool or validator who does not take the actions that are in line with the participants there, people participating in that mining pool, they should leave that mining pool. I think it's a vote of no confidence for people to leave those, and it's a way for the community to really say, hey, we're all here about building a technology that truly is decentralized and global, and it's not captured by any one particular country or something. It's like North Korea has a private internet. Like, we don't want to be on the private internet of North Korea. We want to be on the global internet, right? Or China heavily filters the internet. We want, in America and the free world, various places around the world, most of the countries, We want to be on an open internet. That's what's driven all of this innovation. And yes, occasionally a bad person, uses the internet or something like that, just like they occasionally use cryptocurrency, but go prosecute the bad person. Don't prosecute the technology. So that's kind of what I want to stand for. And I put out a tweet related to that. Coinbase is involved in this too. I mean, we're a large validator of Ethereum. And so we would probably put out a legal challenge or something like that before it ever became a major issue. But if it ever really came down to it, I think we would, minimize our Ethereum 2 validation, or even in the worst case, eliminate it if it meant preserving the integrity of the overall network. So, Vitalik, I don't know if you have an opinion on it or you want to jump in, but yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely an excellent comments all around. I think I agree with all parts of it, and I think obviously I'm fully supportive of people's need to comply with the regulators in whatever jurisdiction